I promise you, we will finish on time. So my name is Ibrahim Zobi. I'm the Senior Vice President for Climate and Sustainability at ADNOC Group. And it's a great pleasure to be here with my fellow colleagues to talk about something I know of, but I think we have the experts here. And I can see some colleagues from the UAE delegation team, the negotiations team, which means this is even more important thing to talk about. So we're talking about today about the carbon border adjustment mechanism, the impacts, the benefits, the mitigation of it, adaptation of it. What does it mean actually to start with? So before we start, I would like to ask the fellow panelists if briefly you introduce yourself, the organization you work for, and a brief why you are in this panel, how you are involved with CBAM. Ivano?
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm a senior advisor to the CEO of Emirates Global Aluminium. I've been dealing with carbon markets for the past 15 years. And the reason I'm here is aluminium is one of those industries heavily impacted by the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And as such, I have a keen interest to see how it will deploy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Miho Shirotori. I'm from the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. I'm an acting director of the Division on International Trade and Commodities. We are looking at CBAM with a great interest as a potential opportunity to really enhance the sustainable development.
Perfect. Thank you. Mustafa?
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. My name is Mustafa Bayoumi. I'm a climate change research fellow at the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy. My areas of research are quite broad, but I have a specific interest in climate finance and also in how CBAM could affect the countries in the Middle East and specifically the UAE. And yeah, hopefully Ivano and I will be collaborating on this.
Thank you. And last but not least, my good friend Cedric.
Hi everyone, my name is Cedric Demeus. I'm heading government relations at Holcim. Holcim is a construction materials company, including cement. And as a cement producer, we're, let's say, big consumer of the carbon market, and CBAM has become a passion, obsession of mine.
Perfect, thank you. So I think we start with Ivano, and Ivano kindly prepared a couple of slides for us. Just to start with, what is CBAM?
Thank you. And again, this is, first and foremost, I would say CBAM is a very hard to pronounce acronym. I mean, we live in a world of TLAs, three-letter acronyms. When we pass it to four, it gets even more complicated. But just to give you an idea, the European Union and its latest legislative package called Fit for 55 addressed a gap in the way the companies, the manufacturers within the EU ETS were dealing with imports of materials. This has been addressed as carbon leakage, essentially the concern that a company, a manufacturer, might choose to move to localize its facility outside of the EU to take benefit of simpler environmental laws. Now, the major reason is that whereas the EU emissions have decreased over time, the emissions from imported materials have actually increased more than what it was expected. As such, the policy is meant to provide a balance for EU producers and manufacturers vis-à-vis imported materials. Now, CBAM is something completely new. There isn't another example that I can think of other than the European trading scheme. So it is something that extends the boundaries of the ETS internationally, even though it's only addressing imports into Europe. It's meant to kick off as of January 1st, 2023. However, just 2 days ago, the European MP in charge of the file announced that there might be small delays. We do not know what the small delays are, but the complexity in adapting an industry, say a manufacturer like EGA, the world's largest manufacturer of premium aluminum, to this methodology is both an opportunity and obviously a challenge. What we're looking at is a transition period between 2023 and 2026-27. The actual start date will negotiate when the transition period starts, and then there will be a compliance requirement. In the first 3 years, CBAM will only require facilities to declare the CO2 emission of the imported materials into Europe, whereas from 2026-27 onwards, they would also have to acquire CBAM certificates, which will be priced alongside weekly average of European ETS allowances for the emissions imported. Now, the segments which are affected are those shown here. As you can see, aluminium is one of them, steel, fertilizers, cement. So that's why my fellow panelists are here to contribute themselves. Aluminium is not the only industry to be affected, but obviously being such a lightweight, infinitively recyclable material, it does add value when looking at carbon emissions and how to use it. The major element of concern, of complexity, is the different reporting mechanisms that already exist. So take EGA as an example. We report our emissions on sustainability reports. We produce life cycle analysis of the metal. We issue statements of embodied carbon emissions. And now we will have a CBAM, making sure that our data is consistent and it's fit for purpose to the requirements of the client is very important, as well as the fact that the process is not being finalized just yet. What we know at the moment is that in order for an entity, a facility, to import into the European Union, they will need to get a CBAM approval prior to custom clearance. This means that, say, and again, I'm using EGA because it's an easy example, our aluminium coming into Europe will need to have filed for a CBAM approval before custom clearance is completed. This means not only looking at the documentation requirements, but also looking at the different Incoterms. So in a delivered duties paid environment, who pays for the CBAM certificates? Who pays when it's custom freight? Who does the submission to the authority? So all those questions have yet to be answered because the process, as I said, has never been implemented before then. And having said that, I hope I have not confused anyone, but rather created enough of a debate to start with.
Well, I think I can see the debate now starting because I can see there is an impact on international trade. And if I may ask you, Ms. Miho, on the, like you talked about EGA and you did give us a general introduction on the other impacts, and maybe on Summit I'll go to Cedric later on, but how can this have an impact on other industries like construction, built environment? What's the impact on industries in general from your perspective? Ms. Miho.
Miho, oh sorry. Thank you. Thank you very much for great introduction. Obviously, because CBAM at the border level acts as an extra tariff, which is equivalent to the CO2, the carbon pricing in the EU domestic part. I mean, if you're talking about the EU, basically the modeling is very, very simple. You know, extra tariff, how much control on the import and export of the products that are subject to CBAM. Now, at UNCTAD, in 2021, we did the analysis of the EU CBAM program, looking at the potential impact on CO2 emission, but also on the international trade flows. Outcome is very, very simple. there would be an increase in the intra-EU trade of these ETS products, cement, aluminium, and so on and so forth, and there'll be a decrease of the exports of non-EU countries of these products. And United Arab Emirates was one of the countries that we looked at it. So our estimate was that if we were using, for example, like a $44 metric carbon ton, it's ad valorem equivalent, meaning the equivalent in terms of the tariff rate was around 4 to 6%. But on aluminium, it was a little bit higher, around the 7%. So it's like an extra 7% tax. So that part of the influence is quite simple. You know, everyone can imagine that the higher tariff, lower exports. Now, my point is this. Now, this is a very simple exercise. This is only looking at the tariffs. But the reality, like you said, is about the administration cost. If the importers have to, you know, really comply with all the reporting exercise and the requirements, have to do this quarterly reporting, have to do all sorts of, you know, emission levels, and also exporters have to understand their level of emission and what would be the equivalent in the carbon pricing. Not many countries actually have the capacity to, you know, comply with this kind of requirement. Now, that's what we call that it can be the potential of becoming a non-tariff barriers. So the estimate that we made in terms of the increase in the intra-EU trade and decrease in the exports from non-EU could be underestimated because we did not take into account the administration costs. So in summary, I think as we move on with this idea of CBAM, which could be extremely positive for controlling the CO2 emission, we also have to think of this standardization methodology so that we can really together decrease the administrative cost. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And this is, if I may come to you, Cedric. Now, we listened to Ivano and me. What does it mean for your industry? What's the impact on your industry?
Look, it's a tool in the end which will have an impact on the full value chain, right? So if as a domestic European cement manufacturer, we want to invest into carbon capture in our domestic facilities, the broad principle is that we need to remain competitive versus domestic players, but also importers that may not have a carbon cost. And that's the principle of the CBAM, and that's why we've been supportive all along, to create this level playing field on carbon costs. What it means on the market is that in fine, we will integrate the carbon cost into the products that we put on the market, which will have an impact on construction materials and have an impact on cost of construction in general. Now, I heard yesterday an interesting figure from the Energy Transition Commission. They give an estimate that it might translate into roughly $50 cost increase per ton cement, which in the end translates into a roughly 3% cost increase for an average single-family house. So society can afford it, but someone needs to pay it somewhere in the value chain. The way we see it is that it's an essential component to finance the net zero transition, to make decarbonized products competitive, and also to collaborate with countries around, because it is not an allowance compliance scheme. It's, as you said, it's a sort of a trade tariff which is based on the carbon footprint of the product that needs to be imported. So the less carbonated this import is, the more competitive it will be. So it's also, and that's the way the European Union approaches it. It's a climate collaboration mechanism which influences countries also either to decarbonize in their own market or to implement carbon pricing in their own market, in which case the CBAM does not apply.
Thank you. So, Mustafa, if we sit back, look at what we just heard from the panelists, how we can look at it as an opportunity. And I have another question, which goes to Ivano as well, and to other panelists. So, from a carbon finance perspective, how we can look at it as an opportunity. The second part of the question is how we can retain the CBAM opportunity in our own country's economies.
The way I see it is we're going to suffer from complexity, like additional complexity, because we've been talking about the EU CBAM, but now the US is also considering it, Canada, multiple other countries as well. And we might get to a level where the complexity becomes similar to, for example, in the financial market with taxonomies, sustainable taxonomies and climate taxonomies and so on. And so we need to find a way in order to actually keep it simple, not overcomplicated, so that everyone can actually still manage to do trade. Because, like Cedric mentioned, in order for this to actually be a success, we need to have collaboration. And in the spirit of the SDGs, for example, leaving no one behind, or in the Paris Agreement with common but differentiated responsibilities, we need to keep in mind that some countries will be very strongly affected by the adoption of the CBAM. So one recent paper, for example, estimated that developed countries could gain around 100 billion US dollars from adopting the EU CBAM, while developing countries will lose around 140 billion, right? Because they will have limitations on their exports and they will have to pay big tariffs. And because in my research as well, I focus on climate diplomacy, so I always try to relate what we're discussing here with what is discussed inside the rooms over there. So, because of these concerns from developing countries, in the case of an adoption of an EU CBAM, without consulting other partners and without involving developing countries in the negotiation, they might risk, and here this is not an opportunity, this is a risk, is that you might lose allies within the negotiation process itself, right? And this would be a big setback.
Sorry, but then why do we need a CBAM?
Because we need others to actually put the effort into decarbonizing their industries and to encourage the countries, for example, least developed countries who are still building their industries, to actually adopt cleaner technologies. One of the issues that we're seeing now is African countries, for example, going straight to gas instead of investing in renewables. And they didn't have a gas sector before that. So we need to support them to actually go to the cleaner options.
Cedric, sorry.
I'd like to jump in on 2 points. First of all, is your question, why do we need a CBAM? From an industrial perspective, our ability to decarbonize net zero relies on the existence of carbon pricing mechanisms. It's a fundamental part of the equation. It's a fundamental part of the business case to build a decarbonization strategy and for individual projects. In countries where we don't have it, it's much more complex. In the US, they don't have a federal carbon pricing mechanism. That's why they came up with the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. It's a fundamental part. It's a different one. And then on your point on the perceived complexity of it, yes, it appears as for the lack of a better word, a pharaonic mechanism and complex. But in fact, it can be made simple because we do have standards. In our sector, there is an international standard. It's now an EN standard, but it will transform into an ISO standard that is used by 80% of the cement industry to report on their emissions. So what will be much more important, well, the overall political framework is super important, but what we call the secondary legislation will be even more important because that's the nuts and bolts. Which standard do we use? And as long as we all use the same standard, that exists, that is international, and which we don't have to argue over. In fact, it will make it pretty simple for companies to, because they use it anyway, to comply on proper monitoring, reporting, verification with the national CBAM authorities, and it can actually be made relatively easy, I think.
You make it sound easy, Cedric. So I hope, sorry, Miho asked
Yes,
us to-
just quickly on this, why do we need CBAM? You know, building on what Cedric was saying, you know, this low carbon, in our analysis, it showed that, okay, I gave a very simplified picture that the intra-EU trade increased and non-EU trade export decreased. But in reality, if you have a deep dive in the details, we actually saw the export of highly skilled, sort of the countries capable of decarbonization has increased to the EU. It's only that the exports of the countries which did not have the technology has fallen. Now, what it showed to us was, in fact, CBAM can really incentivize this spread of the technology. But if we leave it only to the market force, I think it is going to be a huge challenge. So what from the United Nations thinking is that, okay, where can we, look for the fund, for the finance, for the technology transfer? And what about the revenues coming out from, CBAM collection could be really channeled to the building up the capacity?
Absolutely, Ivano, you wanted to say?
Well, I just wanted to add on the complexity, but before that, what a beautiful question. He got us all involved all of a sudden. But first of all, I see the cascading effect of CBAM. All of a sudden, other countries are talking about carbon markets. All of a sudden, MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification, has become mainstream in numerous legislative environments. So there is this standardization cascading down, going from the Paris Agreement to the country governments, subnational governments, and now to the major emitters, large entities, so forth, so on. But what I wish to focus on is the role that COP plays within the CBAM itself. So to give you an example, all our reporting into CBAM will cover Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, so direct and indirect emission. Yet, the European trading scheme only covers Scope 1 emissions. So the mechanisms to recognize Scope 2 emissions are not yet in place. These will have to come through delegated acts that will be part of the implementation book of CBAM, and environments like COP do allow us to interact and to push for this legislation to incorporate the requirements. Just to give you a quick example, in the picture behind me, you have Celestial. Celestial is made with renewable energy. Aluminium is energy intensive. So how do I submit my paperwork in compliance to CBAM if the European ETS does not have a mechanism yet to recognize Scope 2 emissions? So this is just one of the many layers that has yet to be addressed. Well, another layer of complexity that we hope to see solved very soon is also the reporting regime in terms of products. So in our standard operating procedures, we do a blended emission count, and we just distribute it over all the products. How do we bring that from an average to an actual accurate count on a product-by-product basis? And this is where this element of CBAM is allowing major industrial facilities to actually improve their systems. So I know I will be paying CBAM, say, for the next 10 years. I look at it in terms of a financial cost. I can either write a check, or I can actually consider this as the net present value today and invest in decarbonization. So it's maturing those hard-to-abate sectors, and initiatives like the First Mover Coalition actually create this platform for technology to mature.
Does this sound simple to you, Cedric?
Yes, fully supported. And that, for instance, that's why we have the First Movers Coalition, and they just launched the cement and concrete chapter earlier this week. It's super ambitious. You know, when we looked at the figure first, we thought, oh my God, how are we ever going to achieve that? But that's the point. That's the point, is to implement those technologies that are not fully scaled up at the industrial scale today. And that's where these discussions come into play. How do we use carbon pricing to build up the business case and make it a reality as soon as possible?
So I'm going to go back to Mustafa. You can comment on that, but I still did not, I think, a clear answer how we can retain the value of CBAM in our local economies. So Mustafa, you can comment on that.
Yeah.
And it will be good to have Miho's comment on that as well. Mustafa?
Yeah, just very briefly, for me also the complexity comes from monitoring greenhouse gas emissions, right? Because, for example, in the UAE, we have good greenhouse gas inventories and monitoring. But what about countries who are still really having a hard time with reporting their emissions? You know, this is going to be very challenging for them, because they will want to export their product to the EU, and then the EU will ask them, okay, how intense is this product? And they don't have an answer for it, right? So they don't get access to this market. So this is going to be yet another barrier towards developing and least developed countries. Going back to the value, I think the value is going to be broader than the idea of just reducing emissions. We will have to look at how reducing emissions as well from hard to abate sectors, from carbon intense sectors, are going to create value in our societies, because emissions are interlinked with our health as well, right? So you can look at it from not just from a monetary value. We're going to add a lot of value from a societal point of view. Improved health, for example. You encourage innovation, you encourage technology, and then you can actually become even more competitive within these markets. Some markets are very competitive right now, but for countries that are still building their industries, they can actually lead the way in that sense and become competitors with countries you wouldn't think you can compete with from an economic point of view before.
It's a very, very good point. In fact, I think that's how we're going to move in terms of we have to have a new parameters of the value. Exactly. If we're just looking at the economic value of the profit rate, then there's always a limitation that the developing countries, disadvantaged countries without any technology transfer capacity would always be in the losing side. But the value from developing country government's point of view, the value is not only about winning the competition, but the time cycle is much, much longer. It's not about 5 years, 10 years, but in 20-year time, 30-year time, what kind of energy base you really want to have, what kind of CO2 emission that you want to have. So currently, this kind of the long-term framework and the potential values are not incorporated in accounting of the investment. And that's another segment of my organization, have the division on investment, and we are really looking at the sustainable side of the investment to incorporate this new parameter of the values in the system. Thank you.
Listening to you makes a lot of sense, but do we have, Cedric, the simplicity, but do we have barriers, do we have bottlenecks with CBAM?
No. Look, yes, we do. We have, to start with, we have political bottlenecks. In multilateral negotiations, it's one of the main tasks of the EU is to, and I believe they are here to do partly that, is to engage with their trading partners. We have implementation bottlenecks. Yeah. We call it, the system needs to be watertight. You know, if you don't have the proper MRV methodologies, you don't have the proper standards, if there are loopholes into the system, it will not work, neither for importers nor for domestic producers. And just to diverge back on the question you asked before, you know, how do you retain the value in the countries? if I wear my hat of European cement manufacturer, the problem is not the import of clinker or cement into Europe. The issue at stake here is the cost of decarbonized clinker or cement on the European market and how we make those competitive. And so if a non-EU producer lands a decarbonized product on the European market, well, so be it. Great, fantastic. And let's compete for it. And then perhaps the last, the way I see the last bottleneck I see is the timeline. Let's do it. Let's do it now. For us, 2026 is way too late, but that's the political system due to the political hurdles. Yeah, for us as soon as possible.
So assuming we took over the bottlenecks, we're good. Ivano, will this from an Egypt, are we going to see finally a UE carbon market as a response for CBAM?
Absolutely. We're already discussing the MRV, which is the first step towards a carbon market. But also to add on all that was just said, there is obviously impetus. Everything that we're talking about is brand new. So it's not been done before. We cannot use legacy systems. We have to think outside the box and utilize this market-based mechanism, carbon markets, cap and trade, to facilitate the investment into the right technologies that need to be matured ahead of time. And just to give you an example, there is obviously a lot of talk about carbon capture, but still we do not have a clear position whether carbon capture and storage or carbon capture and utilization is recognized within CBAM. We know that the European Union has a position for some application and not others, but in our point of view, regardless of what it is, let's make the technology and the utilization mature ahead of time so that it can be adopted across the different industries.
Okay, we need to wrap up, but Mustafa, I wanted to ask a question. You know, in the second slide of Ivano's presentation, we saw the industries. Do you think we need to add more, if you have a wish list, and you talked about the holistic approach of CBAM, which I really like, and we all agree with you. On your wish list, which industries you'd like to add there?
I mean...
this question can be a wrap-up question for everyone, actually. We'll start with Mustafa.
Yeah, I mean, the perfect scenario is actually to have all industries under it. So you might even consider afterwards transportation, for example. That's a big part, right? Because you have a few countries that actually manufacture high-speed rail, airplanes, and so on. So ideally, that would be covered. But I don't see that happening anytime in the near future because we also need the technology to be ready. And just, I completely share Cedric's enthusiasm, and I would love to see CBAM tomorrow, right? Because it will help us be on track to 1.5 and to 2 degrees, and we're having a window that is very quickly closing, so we need to take action. But I also worry that if I'm a manufacturer in a developing country and this road gets blocked for me, like exporting cement to the EU, all I'm gonna do is just look the other way around and see who doesn't have a CBAM and just go sell my product there. So we have to just be very wary of doing something good that might backfire.
Perfect. Cedric, you would like to add any industry?
Look, I can't answer that for other industrial sectors because my peers do not have the same enthusiasm, or not all of them have the same enthusiasm as me. The only thing I can say, for cement, we're in.
Perfect. Neil?
I think, I mean, I do have this the United Nations neutrality, so I cannot really pick and choose the sector, but I have to say that it's really country specific. It's a context specific, depend on the trade patterns and industrial patterns.
And that's a very diplomatic answer. Thank you for it. Ivano?
Well, along the same lines, I will follow suit. I think it does cover the major emitters. There is a plan, for example, to expand it to the building and the transportation sector, which would make sense. But from my point of view, I just want to end with one thing. 3 years is already a tight deadline. So it is coming tomorrow. 3 years is tomorrow.
Thank you so much. I think we are aligned on acceleration. I personally, I was looking at a solution. I was looking at a mechanism, regardless the complexity, regardless, but it is something, as you said, coming tomorrow. It shows the commitment of the industries, and it shows how we can get into a holistic and a country-specific approach. On behalf of everyone here, thank you for being here. I know it was too early. You had to come early because of the road blockage, so we really appreciate it. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.